Hi guys, thank you very much for being here to listen to me. I know it's been a long day for you guys and you're staying late and I really appreciate it. So the title of my presentation is Risk versus Reward, but before I explain what that means, I wanted to preface my speech with kind of linking to the theme of our TEDxYouth at HJIS, which is lifelong learners. And a lesson for all of you is regarding sharing of photographic rights and such. So I wanted to let you guys all know, all the photos you're going to see in my presentation were either photographed by me or one photograph of me was taken by somebody else with my camera, so I have the rights to share my particular photos. However, I'm also going to be showing you photographs of people's homes and of different people, including children. And we don't just have the right to be able to share those kind of things. I did get permission from the elders from the community to be able to share those in a public forum, the photographs of the children, the photographs of the adults, and such. So as students and lifelong learners, please be aware that this is very important whenever you do a presentation. So risk versus reward. Before I moved here to Japan to come and teach at HJIS, I was living in Ghana in West Africa. And I was living in the capital city of Accra. And anybody who's ever been there knows that Accra is not a very green city. They concrete over everything. They cut down these beautiful old trees along the main roads because they were getting in the way of the sidewalks. So in Accra, there was one area that had some green space. It was Achimota Forest Reserve. And in the area that also surrounded that, it was owned by one of the public secondary schools. And a lot of the public secondary schools and universities in Ghana have a lot of green space and a lot of land. So I would go out there with my dog on weekends to walk and to be able to get rejuvenated. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I want you to take a look at the photo. On the right-hand side, you can see the forest reserve. You can see the taller trees, and these are natural trees. They're not like really tall, like a big rainforest or such, but these are native trees to this area. And then notice on the left, this is more like a meadow. I'm going to come back and address why that is, why there's that discrepancy in just a little bit. Also, I wanted to tell you guys, if you do want to know more about the things I do, you can follow me on my public accounts, which is B.A. Bilgray on Twitter and at Ghana Elephant Goddess on Instagram. So, as I said, there's not a lot of green space in Accra, so I used to go here every weekend so I could walk around, be in nature, kind of rejuvenate after the tough weeks of teaching students. We love you, but sometimes we just need to disconnect. And I've always been a person who's been passionate about nature and wildlife. And in the Achimota Forest Reserve, there is the Accra Zoo, and I actually volunteered there quite a bit, to the fact where I was actually helping to raise some of their rescued baby animals. So I am nature girl and wildlife girl. In fact, before I was a teacher, I used to be a wildlife biologist, and I used to do research on dolphins and manatees in a couple different places around the world. But 20 years ago, I got into teaching. And guys, I'm still here, so obviously you know I'm very passionate and committed to being a teacher. But I missed my wildlife participation and things like that. So I always found a way to make sure I could engage in wildlife activities and wildlife conservation while I was doing my teaching work. When I lived in Thailand, I volunteered at the Marine Endangered Species Unit. When I was in Ghana, I actually got my own elephant research project on wild elephants in one of the national parks. And I actually wanted to kind of take my hat off to Emery, who kind of did a good lead-in for me on this. And the idea is that he was talking about service. And in all honesty, my life has been about service in many ways. My service that I tend to do is around wildlife and nature. It often has a lot to do with animals. Or it could be not just wildlife, maybe domestic animals, rescuing with dogs and cats. But I was never much of a person that did service in interactions with people, like orphanages or elderly homes, like Emery was talking about that he did. I was never very comfortable with it. It was not my thing. So what happened was, as I walked through this area, this green space, I noticed these places where the forest had been cleared, and these wild fields had been cleared, and there were these temporary housing situations set up, or there were crops being grown. And my biased viewpoint made me very annoyed and aggravated that there are these people, these migrants, these squatters, who were here destroying this beautiful natural area. And yes, I was a biased person. And then I was forced to get out of my comfort zone by my dog, Remus. Remus, when we'd go on these walks, would get very curious, and he loved to go and visit with other dogs. And so he would go and engage with these other dogs, and he'd walk into these little villages and these little housing areas where people were, and that would bring people out. First, it was the children. The children were fascinated because Remus didn't look like any other dog in Ghana. And so the children would come and we would start these conversations and I would chat with them. And eventually, sometimes the adults would come out, and I always kept a little distance from the adults. I would engage with the children. You can see the little girl there. Every week I would show up and she'd ask me to wear my sunglasses. And then there was her brother, who used to love to take my dog leash and put Remus on the leash and walk him around, even though he had his own dogs. And so I got to know these children because our commonality was the engagement with the dogs. But again, I kept my distance from the adults. And the reason why I did that was because I was always worried that these poor people, these poor communities, were going to want something from me. They were going to ask me for things. So during this time, I actually moved away from Accra for a year. I was still in Ghana, but a year later I came back, came to walk in these areas again, and these communities were still there. And I began opening my mind to not just the children, but the adults in the area as well. The people, these adults, invited me into their home areas. Not because they wanted something from me, but to talk, to offer me things, to sit down, to have conversations. So I got to see how they lived, up close and personal. So these are migrant people. They're not migrants because they were forced out due to civil unrest, but they were looking for a better life. They came from Togo or Burkina Faso or rural areas of Ghana because they hoped to make money and to better their lives in the capital city of Accra. And this is how they were living until they could do that. In this particular village, there were not a lot of men around. Many of the men had abandoned the women and their children. There were a couple of men that had stayed and were helping out in this area. And some of these men would actually go out during the day and work and try and make money. Some of the women would go out and work and they would try and sell things along the roadside, and again, try to make some money for the community. But this is a cycle of poverty where it was hard for them to get out. They didn't have enough money to rent a place, so they squatted in this area. They're not the only community doing this. There's many, many communities in this area that are doing this. But look at the way they lived. Their houses were made of old signs and banner signs. And they used those to try and keep the rain out, and not often were successful with that. The area in the middle there, that's their cooking area. That's their kitchen. You can see just next to my dog, the little stove that they used. They put charcoal in that. And the pot on the very right in that same picture is they would put that on the charcoal and cook their food that way. There's no running water in this community. There's no electricity in this community, so there's no refrigeration here. So how do these people get their water? They collect these old cooking oil vats, clean them out, and then use them to collect water. They would have to walk at least half a kilometer, if not more, in a single direction, with the vats on their head, or sometimes a few of them put in a wheelbarrow to go and get water. Because water's so vital, they would have to make multiple trips each day. Water's important because they use it for drinking. They use it for cooking. They wash up their dishes. They clean their linens and they clean their clothes using water. So every day they would have to go and collect this water. Now you would think living in a community like this, these people would be dirty. They're not. These are some of the most hygienic people I know. This is how they bathe their children. Again, no running water. For the adults, they did have a little enclosed area, but it was the same thing. They would take a cup of water and pour it on themselves, soap up, and then take another cup of water to rinse off. I hope you're starting to empathize with this community like I was. Not only that, but because they're squatters in this area, every few months the police or soldiers would come around, give a warning, and then come with bulldozers and move through their entire community, knocking down the houses and destroying their stuff. And then they said, if you're not out of here within 2 days, we're going to come back and burn your things. And so they have nowhere to go, so they would move to just a little bit down the way to another place, clear another field, and set up home there. And then a few months later, this would happen. It wasn't just the soldiers being mean. In this area, there are bad people. Not this community, not most of the communities, but there's drugs, there's people that engage in violent activity, there's theft. But these people suffered the cost for that, even though they're innocent. So now I want to introduce you to the community now that you know their background. You would think these would not be happy people, that they would lead a depressive life and that they would just be despairing of everything. But I want you to look at the faces here. These are not a desperate people. These are a happy and very joyful people. They were so generous of heart. You can see some of the clothes here look a little bit ratty, torn. Some of the clothing might be dirty, but I did show you they bathe daily. But when it came to church and faith, they had such great faith, and they were so proud of themselves that they would always put on their best clothing. Remember, there's no electricity here, so they use these coal irons in order to press their clothing, and they always looked beautiful on Sunday mornings on their way to church. So I began to think, how do I interact with these people? What can I give them? And part of it was just going and talking with them and playing with the children and treating them like regular human beings. Not that they were in need of anything. I didn't ever talk down to them. And so just being with them was something that I could do for them. It helped with dignity. I'd go and I would do exercises with the children. And sometimes even the adults like to get involved in those activities. I always loved it when the youngest one would want to participate, and she even tried to do push-ups one day. Yeah. Which brings me to this concept of sharing is caring. These people who have very little in their lives are the most generous people I've ever met in my life. And it all started because of the hikes with my dogs and my dogs coming into their communities panting. They started by putting water out for my dogs to drink. Now remember, I told you how these people had to go and get their water. And yet they were still willing to share that water with my dogs. Then they started by offering some of their food, some of their meat, to share with my dogs. They wanted to share with me too. They would collect corn from their fields, and then they'd send me home with several ears of corn. Or they'd collect the ground nuts, or what we know as peanuts, and they'd give me huge bagfuls of peanuts to take home with me. I was saying no at first, and then I realized this is something they wanted to do. It was pride, and then I happily took that stuff from them. So in addition to just treating them like equals to me, I wanted to see what else I could do for them. The children were well fed, even in these poor communities. They weren't going hungry. So I began bringing them additional treats. On weekends, I'd bring them juice or milk, cake or cookies. I would bring them, they asked for, not give us, but they were interested in children's storybooks. And so I found some that were based on African stories, and I brought them the books, and the older kids would read these books to the younger kids. Students at my last school in Ghana did a clothing drive so we could donate clothing to this community. And then when the pandemic hit and the government was doing nothing for these impoverished, vulnerable communities, I secured 400 masks that I brought to this particular village and said, use what you need and then give them out to everybody else to try and help keep people safe. And the children took joy in such simple things. I would bring a rope and teach them how to do Jacob's ladder, and they had so much fun trying to learn how to do this. I brought a soccer ball, and the older boy would play with all these little kids who didn't have the skills and have the best time playing with them. And something as simple as my dog leash. The kids would fight every weekend that I would show up to grab one of the 2 dog leashes I had so they could make games with those dog leashes and play. These are not people who feel desperate, who act desperate, who are suffering over their circumstances. They find joy in the little things in life. And what that started getting me to do was thinking about my life, and all these things that I thought were problems really aren't problems. It gave me joy just to come and visit this community. So as I said, I had brought some students from my last school there for a CAS project, and they talked to the people in the community, and besides the clothing drive, they discovered that one of the things the community really wanted in a way to help was to help raise fees to pay for the kids to go to school. And so my students were able, through their CAS project, to raise enough money to send 8 of these children to school for a year. And then I donated an additional amount of money so we could send 8 more students. So we sent a total of 16 students to school for a year. And then the pandemic hit, and kids were not allowed to go to school anymore. But we wanted these kids, because education is going to be their way out of this cycle of poverty. So I talked to my adult friends in this community. What can I do? What can we do to help the kids? And they found a tutor. So I paid for the tutor to come, and he came. They have a whiteboard, and he would teach them. And so instead of 16 kids, we actually got 21 kids educated during the pandemic. Now the government has reopened schools. The tutors are no longer really available, so we want to get these kids back into school. But my students at my last school graduated, so now I'm working on trying to find funds to help send these kids to school again. And I want to thank Emory and the SRC for their no poverty and education fundraisers that they've been doing, because some of that money that you guys had contributed is going to go towards helping these kids. And I want you to hear from, sorry. I was hoping the video's not going to work, but I wanted you to hear from one of the boys himself about why these kids want to go to school. I mean, think about it. You guys, even Emory was talking about this, you're like, when is it the weekend? When do we have a holiday? Oh, we have no school next Tuesday. You get really excited about that. These kids get excited when they know that they can go to school. They want to go to school. They're desperate to go to school because they know that education will help them towards a better life. So the risk of engaging with people.
I'm excited to go to school, Ebolo.
They want to learn and be a great person in future.
Oh, so that's why they're excited that they now
Getting out of my comfort zone.
Oh, very good.
Did not only reward this community, it rewarded me. I have found a family in Ghana I'm still in touch with them. I still help them out from afar. They still send me updates about what the children are doing. These are my kids, and I miss them desperately. I'm very happy to be here at HJIS in Japan, but I very much miss my Ghanaian family. And I hope that you have a better appreciation for your life and a little bit more empathy on how we can help these types of communities. Thank you very much for your time today.